I'm Jim Speta. I am the interim dean at Northwestern Law School, and it's my pleasure to welcome Senator Murphy as the keynote address in this symposium. Before I do so, let me thank all the students on the Northwestern Law Review, and of course all of those at the Duke Center on Firearms for putting together what has so far been a fantastic conference, and which will continue, of course, with our keynote and with the additional two panels this afternoon. It's a wonderful, wonderful exercise in scholarship and policy that we're really proud of here. Senator Murphy is, of course, represents the state of Connecticut in the United States Senate. He serves on the Foreign Relations Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. Before coming to the Senate, Senator Murphy served for 3 terms in the U.S. House, representing the 5th Congressional District in Connecticut, I'm sorry. Following the tragic shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012, Senator Murphy became one of the leading proponents of reforms to reduce gun violence. And his book today, which will be the subject of the interview, has been quite impactful. He has championed a number of bipartisan bills aimed at expanding background checks and keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. Senator Murphy is a leading voice in the anti-gun violence measure movement, also a leading voice for smarter foreign policy and reform of the nation's mental health systems. Before he came to Congress, Murphy served in the State House in Connecticut, graduated from Williams College, a different kind of purple, but also a purple in his blood, and received his law degree from the University of Connecticut School of Law. I am quite pleased to welcome Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Dean Speta. So, Senator Murphy, your book is fantastic, and for everyone here in the audience, we have The Violence Inside Us, just was published, and Adam and I cranked through it here in the last few weeks to prepare, and it really was excellent. I think part of what makes it so timely for our symposium today is that you navigate both the legal and the political really well, and you know, this symposium is has primarily an audience of lawyers and you know, future lawyers, and so our first 2 panels of the day have started focusing more along the legal dimension, and I want to kind of bridge us from that legal into the political with an admission that you write. You call it a bombshell that I think might come as a surprise to a few folks here in the audience. And you write, "I think Heller is basically correct." And I definitely took that as a surprise when I read it. And so I'm wondering, where do you think that this admission gets you, both with your fellow peers in the Senate and elected officials, and then also with the broader public?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for having me here today and giving me a chance to talk about the broader issue of reducing gun violence in the country and some of the legal and political conversations that are really important as we head into what I think will be a dispositive year, 2021, on this issue. Thank you for putting together what seems like just a fantastic forum. Yeah, listen, I took a lot of time in getting ready to write this book with the constitutional history surrounding the Second Amendment. I know 5%, 2% of what other speakers as part of your forum know about it. But you know, in my review, I came to the conclusion that our founding fathers, likely, writing the Second Amendment to deal primarily with the issue of militias, also believed in a common law right of gun ownership. I think they would probably be surprised at a government that thought it had the constitutional ability to take away firearms from a broad cross-section of the American public. Now, as I'm sure you've talked about, obviously at the time of our founding, guns were heavily regulated. Folks were very used to having to, register their gunpowder or be dispossessed of their firearms. And so it's, I think, safe to say that broad regulation of the kind of weapons that can be owned or the kind of things you have to do in order to own a weapon are certainly constitutional and envisioned by our founding fathers, but I also came to the conclusion that there probably was a belief at the time that there was also a broad right to private sector gun ownership. Now, you ask sort of a more political question, what does that get you? Well, I think it's just the sort of right conclusion legally, though listen, I would write Heller differently. I agree with it broadly. What I think it gets us is perhaps an ability to pierce one of the most effective arguments from those who align themselves with the gun lobby, which is that, hey, people like Murphy, they tell you that they just want to stop criminals from buying guns. They tell you that they just care about banning these AR-15s, but really their agenda is broad gun confiscation. And they believe that the Constitution allows them to take away all of our guns. And so if you let them get the nose under the tent, then you're going to have 60 camels inside that thing, within a couple of years. And so I do believe that by sort of taking the position that though we don't want to take away people's guns, we also don't believe the Constitution allows us to do that. It sets aside that argument about this secret agenda that many of us in Congress have allegedly who push for these more incremental reforms.
Senator, I'd like to maybe kind of pick up, I think, on something that kind of animated your response there, which is the rhetoric that kind of frames this debate around firearms and firearm regulation. And I think that frame is this kind of like adversarial framing of where those who advocate for firearm reform, firearm legal reform, or increasing regulation are against the Second Amendment and against the Constitution and constitutional rights. And those who, in contrast, those who push back on a reform agenda or gun laws are for the Constitution and are for the Second Amendment and our constitutional rights. But I think, again, kind of building on your response there and on your larger discussion in the book, you kind of seem to thread the needle and kind of take almost like a third position between these two poles along the spectrum. I was wondering if you could maybe do a little more to reconcile, or how you feel that one can reconcile those two seemingly inconsistent positions.
I don't think it's hard. I mean, I'm for the Second Amendment. I'm just for the real Second Amendment, not the imagined Second Amendment. I mean, our founding fathers were very comfortable with the heavy regulation of guns. As I mentioned, at the time that amendment was written, there were broad populations of Americans, mostly for the wrong reasons, that were prohibited from owning firearms. There were regulations around registering your weapons, registering your gunpowder. In early America, concealed weapons restrictions were fairly regular. And so, well, I do think the Second Amendment says, hey, listen, we believe in the general right of Americans to own guns. And at the time, that was rooted in the need to be able to put together militias on short notice. It's also perfectly consistent to regulate that right, which is frankly how we view most of our Bill of Rights. Most of the rights inside the first 10 amendments, right? There is a right to free speech, but there are confines around that, right? There are libel laws, right, for instance. And so I think that most Americans sort of will broadly accept that the Second Amendment sort of protects the private right of gun ownership, but allows for that right to be regulated. I think that's probably where 80 to 90% of Americans are right now. And so if that's where Democrats end up, then that's a political advantage for us, because it sits us inside the mainstream of this debate.
So pivoting a little bit to what I would say is kind of like the solid middle of your book, which is diagnosing the gun violence epidemic as we have it today, or as it exists today. You use the chapter headings: the violence we see, the violence we ignore, and the violence we export. And I think one of the more powerful arguments you make is that we we need to think about this more broadly, particularly in that middle chapter, the violence we ignore. And there's no doubt that it connects with, the protests for racial justice that we see today. And instead of just looking at victims of gun violence in a vacuum, you argue, for example, that for every single death, there's 20 others at least that are impacted, right? And you also really persuasively argue or write about the effect of the relationship between gun violence and suicide, right? You write the lion's share of American violence is actually suicide. And I think that's a really powerful reframing. And obviously, to go back to that legal versus political tension that we were discussing earlier, those carry, that rhetoric carries tremendous force from a political angle. And so I want to give you an opportunity to expand on that, not only from the political, but then also from the legal side, right? Because I think that's an aspect of this symposium that we haven't discussed as much.
Yeah, well, this book, as you mentioned, is sort of divided into three parts. The beginning of the book is sort of sets the table. It explains the sort of biological instincts towards violence that I think you have to understand in order to overcome violence. It talks about the broad global history of violence rates and how, frankly, violence has come down by droves over the last 500 years because of human interventions. Talks about the story of American violence, which is a very unique story that is a story of race and poverty and access to guns. The back end of the book is kind of the path forward, right? What we know about the interventions from a public policy standpoint that reduce gun violence and violence in general. But the middle of the book is this discussion of the different kinds of violence. And, I think it's important to understand that there are differences between suicides and gun homicides. For instance, America is a global outlier on gun homicides. There's no other country in the high-income world that comes close to the rate of gun homicides. We are not a global outlier when it comes to the rate of suicide, and that's interesting. Now, we're at the high end, but there are countries that have higher rates of suicide than the United States does, which means for suicides, it's not just about the guns. And I think you have to sort of understand that. The demographics are fundamentally different. While gun homicides are, primarily a problem within poorer communities of color, gun suicides are really a white rural male phenomenon. And the book goes into explaining why there are differences. At the same time, there are intersections, especially when it comes to the public policies that move the numbers. Well, I admit in the book that changing gun laws alone will not sort of stop America from being this global outlier on violence rates. It does have an effect across the board. What we see from state law changes is that when you make guns just a little bit harder to get, right, waiting periods or registration, permits, all of those numbers come down. Suicide numbers come down, homicide numbers come down, domestic violence crimes come down, accidental shootings come down. And so while there are differences in the explanation of why these different kinds of gun deaths occur, the interventions have some connectivity to them. And I think that that's important to understand as well. And then lastly, Elliot, you talked about this as trying to understand the broad scope of violence. And I think that's important as well. We call it a public health epidemic because it is. I described this story in the book where I'm visiting an elementary school in Baltimore, and while I'm there, there's a lockdown because a couple blocks from the school, there's been a shooting. Come to find out later in the day, after I'd left the school, that it was actually a parent, a father who had dropped his twin girls off at school that morning and had driven home. And when he got out of his car, he was shot dead on his doorstep. And you have to understand what that does to that entire school, right? All of those kids now are faced with the reality that by the time they get home from school, their parent may not be alive. And that ripples throughout that community. So it's no coincidence that the underperforming schools in this country are largely in the violent neighborhoods, because these kids' brains get changed when they are experiencing that level of regular trauma. I mean, I was there for literally 2 hours and one of the parents got shot while I was there. That's not coincidence. That just shows you how regular this violence is in many of these communities.
Kind of continuing, Senator, the talk about kind of some of the research that you did. I think it kind of followed a little from into like the biology and such that you just referenced, was this idea of in our country's history, the role in violence that the in-group and kind of out-group distinction kind of played, and how you go on to discuss the role of violence that the in-groups would use to kind of subjugate and control the out-groups. I was wondering if you could maybe explore that theme a little bit more, and then discuss how you think that continued through to today, and what you think that might look like in the future.
Well, I'm not breaking, any new ground here. This is pretty standard sociological analysis of how throughout history, not just in the United States, but in many other places, dominant groups use violence on a regular basis in order to maintain their position. And in the United States, it's just a unique story in that at the outset, it was settlers, colonists using epidemic levels of violence to subjugate native tribes. Thanksgiving may be a celebration of community between settlers and Native Americans, but there's also a chance, as I explain in this book, that our Thanksgiving holiday is actually the celebration of a massacre by colonists in Connecticut of a local tribe. And so we have to recognize from the very beginning, we've used violence and guns in order to order society. But what's interesting is that after the sort of settling of America, our violence rates kind of settle back down, and we are on par with our European neighbors with respect to violence rates up until the sort of 1830s, 1840s. It is upon the invention of the cotton gin and the massive expansion of the slave population that American violence rates start to skyrocket once again, because now, in order to keep all of these African Americans enslaved, we need daily massive levels of violence. And the whole country during this period of time just kind of becomes inured to violence. We become numb to it because it's how we order our economy. It's how we're sort of cheating our way to global economic prominence. And we've never come back down. Our American violence rates have never returned to high income norms after the 1830s and 1840s. And all that's happened is the sort of method of the violence has changed. It's moved from enslavement to vigilanteism, right? Lynchings, to mass incarceration and police brutality. So that story really is a continuous one of white majorities using violence in order to maintain a position of superiority over communities of color. And if you don't understand that, and you don't understand how systemic racism builds violence, then you are going to misunderstand how much impact you can make by changing gun laws. Because if you change the gun laws, but you still maintain that system of out-group domination by in-groups, then your violence rates are still going to be far higher than they should be.
So building on that history part, you discuss, I think, what might be one of the greatest first American PR campaigns with the Colt pistol, right? And I want to use that as a transition into a dimension that I think is also missing, which is this economic dimension. I think it's a really important one when we think about the firearms conversation, right? Whenever we regulate guns, it necessarily is going to affect the gun industry's bottom line. And I think that economic dimension is implicit, both implicit and explicit throughout your entire book, right? Like closing loopholes reduces the number of guns that they sell. An AR-15 assault weapon sells for 3 to 10 times the amount of, a corresponding popular handgun, right? So we often think about the issue in moral terms, but any thoughts that you have about where this economic dimension fits into our understanding of this debate.
Well, you mentioned the story of Samuel Colt, who I tell in this book. I'm very cognizant of the fact that, this is a book about violence. And, when you're deciding what to read on your own time, a book on violence is often not the one that you want to pick up. It's a depressing topic, and particularly America's recent history of gun violence is depressing. And so, what I try to do throughout this book is tell a lot of compelling stories that are part of this narrative. And the story of Samuel Colt is just a fascinating one. This is a kid who grows up in Connecticut and Massachusetts, absolutely obsessed with firearms and explosives. Like from the time that he's a little kid, all he can think about is blowing things up and how guns work. And he's essentially a teenager when he discovers the way for a gun to fire repeatedly, essentially without human intervention, the repeating revolver. And he sets up a factory, which becomes the biggest factory floor in the world in the middle to late 1800s on the Connecticut River in Hartford. And he also figures out that he can market his guns in connection with these developing American values of freedom and entrepreneurship and liberty. And so he recruits all of these pioneers of the Wild West to sell his guns because those sort of values of westward expansion and American expansion, he finds if he connects them to the gun, makes the product much more marketable. And so at the very beginning, it's critical for us to understand the way in which the economics of guns and the way that the gun industry deliberately connects itself to values that we all share has been essential to the industry. But it's also important to understand the modern economics of guns because gun ownership is changing rapidly. In 1980, half of American households own guns. Today, 22% of Americans own guns, a third of American households, and that number is plummeting. And so the gun industry now is reliant not on selling one or two guns to every house. It now needs to sell a whole mess load of weapons to a very small number of gun owners. In fact, today, 3% of Americans own over half the guns in the country. And so the NRA, sort of as a patron of the gun industry, then has to all of a sudden become more radical. It has to brook no compromise. It has to say, the only way for you to protect yourself is a gun. And it has to argue that the government is coming to take your weapons, so you better load up on them right now before they come and get you. And that message, which is so out in right field, so radical, is really only intending to speak to 3 or 4% of Americans, because that's who's driving the profit of the gun industry today. And so, when we sort of tear our hair out and say, well, why is the NRA adopting positions that their own membership don't agree with? Well, it's because the NRA is reflective of the modern gun industry, which is selling tons of expensive weapons to a very small slice of Americans. And what's happened is that the country's kind of finally figured that out. And that's why the NRA's approval ratings are imploding. That's why they're much less influential today.
Kind of keeping with the gun industry and the NRA, something that you address in your book is this idea that guns kill people, guns don't kill people, people kill people, or you can't regulate evil, which are oftentimes assertions made again by the NRA or gun manufacturers. But the latter, the idea that you can't regulate evil, was actually an idea that you early on in your career supported and in fact often repeated. But you changed your mind. I was wondering if you could maybe walk through kind of what led to that shift.
Yeah, I mean, this book is mostly a book about biology and history and public policy. It's intended to be a sort of primer on the issue of violence in America. But I do sort of weave throughout it, elements of my political transformation, and it has been a transformation. I think you're referring to this conversation I write about in the book that I had during one of my state legislative races, in which a guy approaches me as I'm walking into a fair to campaign and asks about guns, my position on guns, and I immediately deflect I give an answer that the NRA would be proud of. I say something like, "Oh, well, it's not the guns that we should be focused on. It's the people, right? And we should ask why they're committing the crime in the first place." And I gave that answer because I was just taught as a sort of young up-and-coming politician in the 1990s and 2000s to stay away from the issue of guns, that it was a loser, that it was a third rail. And so I did, and I'm mortified by that decision. I'm deeply embarrassed for two reasons. One, because my avoidance of the issue was allowing people to be killed because there weren't enough of us sticking up for tougher gun laws, but also because that mythology was wrong. In fact, even back then, if you had run strongly on the issue of universal background checks, you would have won votes. It was an NRA constructed myth that this was a controversial issue. Today, maybe 95% of people support universal background checks, but in 2000, 85% supported it. And so it's not necessarily that my positions have changed. I've always been in support of universal background checks and bans on assault weapons. It's just that I've stopped being so afraid of the issue as I was, embarrassingly so, back in my state legislative days and my early days in the Congress. And obviously I had a moral awakening, having gone through Sandy Hook and having sat with the parents in the north end of Hartford who explained to me the regularity of gun violence that they experience. But I also just did a study of the politics and realized that on a political argument alone, it was much smarter for my party to be talking up rather than talking down the issue of ending gun violence.
So speaking of your state legislator days, where, you're the two kind of, I think, broad buckets of your policy prescriptions you offer is background checks and regulating assault weapons. And, a regular legal conversation that we have, every con law student learns is, federalism and has to enter the picture somewhere. And so in your mind, where does federalism fit into this? Where do state legislatures, as opposed to, our federal government, where do you see there being overlap? Where do your policy prescriptions fit into that?
Well, the gun industry is a classic interstate industry. There is no way to effectively regulate firearm ownership in this country if you're not doing it both at a state level and at a national level. And so, particularly on the issue of background checks, there has to be a national requirement for background checks in order for that requirement to be effective. Why? Well, because guns easily move across state borders. And so what you find is that the crime guns that are being used in Connecticut are by and large not bought in Connecticut because, the criminals who traffic those guns out of vans in the east end of Bridgeport couldn't buy them in Connecticut. They would be prohibited. So they drive down to South Carolina or Georgia, where they can buy guns online or at a gun show without having to go through a background check. They pick them all up there and then they bring them up to Connecticut. And so unless you have that national background check requirement, Connecticut's background check laws can't protect itself adequately. And so I think there's reasons to have state laws. What I would argue for is a federal floor on issues like background checks, issues like the prohibition of certain weapons, like AR-15s, that states were then able to build upon. But without that floor, our laws are maybe not feckless, because we've shown in Connecticut we've actually reduced gun crimes with a tight universal background checks law requirement, but they're much less impactful than they could be.
Kind of related to that, kind of keeping this idea of localism, the issue that you just described of individuals going down to, say, Georgia, purchasing firearms, bringing them back to Connecticut, of course, is something that happens here in Chicago, with Illinois sharing borders with Indiana and Wisconsin. But I was wondering if you could maybe, you mentioned Chicago in your book. Specifically, you refer to it as the crucible for the conversation about the role firearms play in society. For all of our Chicagoans in the audience, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that point, and whether you think Chicago has some kind of a special role to play in the work on gun reform, or just maybe spend a little more time discussing that.
Well, the rates of gun violence in Chicago are absolutely unacceptably high. It's tragic. But as I point out in the book, on most years, Chicago is not a top 10 city with respect to gun violence rates. So why does America think that Chicago is the most violent city in the country? Well, the reason is Barack Obama is from Chicago. And during the Obama presidency, Chicago became proxy for Black. And the conservative right focused all of its attention on Chicago. Matt Drudge had a feature on his website in which he posted news stories every week called Chicagoland. If you watched Fox News, they focused on a regular basis on gun crimes in Chicago because the conservative right wanted to make gun crime simply about crimes committed by Black people against Black people. Thus, something that the rest of the country didn't need to worry about because it was a habitually criminal element of Black Americans that were committing these crimes in neighborhoods inside cities that you, white people, really never have to worry about or step foot into. And it was then also a way to attach Barack Obama to that epidemic as well. So, that's the argument that I make in the book is that, well, you obviously have to recognize that Chicago has gun violence rates that are incredibly high. It became the focus of the nation because the gun lobby, again, wanted to racialize the conversation. They wanted to marginalize gun crimes as something that only happened in communities of color. America has rejected that notion. I think more Americans today care about the issue of gun violence for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that nobody can escape it now. Every parent has to talk to their kid coming home from an active shooter drill, but also because a lot of Americans have, watched what has happened in places like Chicago or New Haven or New Orleans, and they think it's their problem too. And they just don't believe this idea that just because it's happening more regularly in neighborhoods filled with people who have a different skin color than you, that it's not a problem you should care about.
Having grown up just west of the city, I really appreciated that departure into why Chicago matters. I want to make sure to emphasize that everyone in the audience, feel free to submit questions. We're going to pivot and make sure to answer a few of them. I want to start with one that I think really gets at the moment we're currently in, where law enforcement and policing is in the public eye. There is increasing skepticism towards policing and law enforcement. And is there, if we push for greater gun regulation, right, and gun laws, are you concerned at all that might exacerbate existing inequalities and worsen the problems of, as this question puts it, the carceral state that we currently have?
Well, that's why, I think the universal background checks proposal that we have at the federal level is the right way to go, because right now you have massive numbers of illegal weapons that are moving through the streets of cities. And you are right, that often ends up in low-income citizens of color being arrested for the possession of those weapons. The genius of a federal universal background checks bill is that it dramatically reduces the number of illegal weapons that flow into these cities. Listen, I document them in this book. I've had conversations, plenty of them, with kids in these cities who say, I need a gun. Like, I don't care what you're telling me. This is a ridiculously violent place that I live in, and how else am I going to protect myself? The cops aren't going to protect me. People are coming after me. I need a gun. Now, all the studies tell you that if you own a gun, you are much more likely to either end up arrested or dead, then use that gun in defense of yourself against someone else. But I understand where that young man is coming from when he says that to me. And so the answer is just make sure there are a lot fewer guns that are sold out on the streets of Bridgeport, Connecticut illegally. And that's what background checks gets you. And then it's also a recognition that, as I talk about in this book, the issue of law enforcement in communities of color is a nuanced one, because there is at the same time too much law enforcement and not enough law enforcement. So, people are being persecuted for nuisance crimes, for nonviolent offenses, for no offense at all. But then in many cities across America, when crimes are committed against African Americans, homicides, for instance, they go unsolved. And so there becomes this private system of justice that plays out because these communities don't think that the white police officers are actually going to solve their crimes. And so Giuliovi, who wrote a brilliant book called Ghetto Side about this phenomenon in Los Angeles, I talk about her findings, which is that in what would reduce violence in Los Angeles is less policing attached to nonviolent offenses, and more policing and more effective policing to actually catch the perpetrators of murders and homicides.
It's a really important point to remember, especially in a symposium when we're thinking about these legal dimensions. The law is not always enforced equally, even in a single locality, let alone within a state and nationally. It's really important.
And it's not enforced equally because we fundamentally value Black life less, and we've made that decision as a society, and it shouldn't shock us that that's how our law enforcement ends up prioritizing decision making. I just to append a story I told earlier today. After I learned that there had been this father who was killed in Baltimore after dropping his beautiful twin daughters off at school, I went online to do an internet search to learn more about what happened in this guy's story. Nothing. I found one vague article in one of the Baltimore papers about it, but there was no examination of who he was or what happened or who those girls were. Let me guarantee you that if a white high-income father in Westport, Connecticut, or in suburban Chicago dropped his two twin girls off at school, went back to his suburban home, and was shot on the doorstep before he got in, CNN would be covering it that night. It would be a national story. And so law enforcement doesn't prosecute and investigate crimes against African Americans because the whole country has made a decision that their murders don't matter as much as murders that occur to white people. And unless you figure that out, then there are going to continue to be these private systems of justice. You're going to continue to have high homicide rates. And that's why it's not just about the guns. It has to be about this broader conversation.
So it looks like we have a question here that kind of picks up on the connectivity between the economics of the firearm industry with kind of the rhetoric around the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. In the past couple of months, there's been a real spike in individuals purchasing firearms. Some data suggests many of them are first-time gun buyers. And so this question seems to ask whether you think this increase in new gun ownership might be a new normal that could shift permanently the substance of the gun debate.
So I think this narrative about the spike in gun sales being driven by first-time gun buyers is not true. That is largely anecdotal. That is a narrative that is preferred by the gun industry. And I think that when everything settles down, we will find that, in fact, these spikes in gun sales, which are real, right? I mean, you have seen consecutive months which have set records for monthly sales through the background check system, are driven by that same 3%. So I think what you are seeing is, a very targeted messaging campaign from the gun industry and the NRA to that same group of people that I've been talking about throughout this conversation. And their message has been, especially since the George Floyd protests began, that Antifa and the radical left are coming for you. And if you don't arm up like that couple in St. Louis, then you're done for. And so, the guys that had 17 weapons decided to buy 6 more. So I'm not saying that there aren't some people who are buying guns for the first time, possibly because they are still driven to fear those other than them. But I think a lot of this is the same folks. And listen, this goes back to the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book talks about the biology of violence, and at the root of the conversation about the biology of violence is this trigger we have inside of us, whether we like it or not, to fear people who are different than us. Right? We didn't have these giant horns on our heads. We didn't have big fangs, and so we learned early on that the only way to protect ourselves as a species, this is thousands of years ago, was to form tribes and groups. And we created a set of genetic code that we passed down, which told us that when somebody looked different or felt different from us, to spike adrenaline levels and to regard them as an enemy. Now, we don't sort of feel like we think that way today, because we have, in some parts, in some ways, overcome that biology. But it still sits inside of us, and we have these leaders come along every now and again, like Donald Trump, who play to that biology and tell people, hey, you got to fear people from Mexico, you got to fear Muslims, you got to fear Black people. And unfortunately, part of the reason why you see gun sales spike when you get that messaging is that that message still plays to this inclination to fear those that are different. And Donald Trump, from the very beginning, knew that. He knew that it could get him votes. The gun industry has known that it would drive up their sales. And I think that's by and large what's happened over the last 6 months.
Well, and building on that, I believe, the last 6 months have also seen record donations to the ACLU, right? And this fear, right? And so fear operates in different ways, but across the political spectrum. No, there's no doubt about it. But picking up on this messaging point, right? And NRA messaging, and coming back to something that you started with, we have a question here about, how do you dissipate the fear of those who genuinely believe that background checks are a first step to confiscation, right? That not even the point that some other, that some presidential candidates made, that they're going to come take your weapons, but that, background checks it's a slippery slope, right? And so maybe that's part of why you concede a point about Heller, right? But in general, in this political lens, what can regulation advocates do to demonstrate their commitment to a balance, or a Second Amendment that is not toothless?
Right. Well, when it comes to the issue of background checks, if that's the specific nature of the question, you're talking about 5 to 10% of the population, and I think my answer is I'm just not going to worry about them. Like, I just don't think my burden is to get to 97 or 98%, right? Like, puppies don't have a 95% approval rating in this country. And so I just sort of feel like the issue here is not that I haven't convinced enough people on background checks. It's frankly not that I haven't convinced enough people on the issue of assault weapons. Today, 70% of Americans want assault weapons banned. For the first time ever, the majority of Republican voters want assault weapons banned. It's that the political power dynamics are still all askew. And we've been undergoing the process of building more political power, getting more people elected. It takes time, who are going to reject the orthodoxy of the past and usher in a new era of smart, common sense, pro-Second Amendment gun regulation. So this is a question I often get, which is that, how do you talk to these people who still don't believe in these things? And I say, well, listen, you're right that I think conceding the general constitutionality of Heller does pick us up some support, and I'm never going to give up on trying to make my arguments more effective, but I actually don't spend a lot of time thinking about how to get that last 5 or 10%. I just don't think that's probably going to do much for me in terms of the marginal utility of my time and effort.
This looks like a Chicago native question about universal background checks and how those background checks might interact with straw purchases of firearms, which again is something you mentioned a few moments ago, is a big issue in your state, but also again here in Illinois. So how do you see universal background checks kind of ameliorating those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, so straw purchases are, where somebody's coming in and buying guns who is allowed to buy guns, who is a legal purchaser, and then transferring them to someone who is not allowed to buy guns and sell guns. And so it is true that a universal background checks system still allows for straw purchasing. One of the things we can do is to make straw purchasing a federal crime. Right now, it is prosecuted primarily at the state level, and by giving an enforcement tool on straw purchasing to the feds, it does up the deterrent effect on those who are going to consider doing so. And it is also true that it will become a bigger problem once you have universal background checks in the gun show and online space, because right now it could be that as much as 30%, maybe 35% of all gun sales are happening outside of the background check system in gun shows and online. And so once all of those gun sales are subject to a background check, then the only way that you'll be able to sort of get guns as a criminal is through a straw purchase. And so, dramatically ramping up the enforcement, making it a federal crime, empowering the ATF to actually pursue those cases in a way that they aren't empowered now, is, I think, part of the solution. And one of the chapters in the book that was the most fun for me to write was the chapter on the violence we export. In it are a bunch of just fascinating stories, and many of them revolve around the way in which straw purchases are used to traffic guns into Latin America, and how almost every single gun being used in Mexico for gun crimes by the drug cartels is bought in the United States by straw purchasers. And so, and often guns bought at gun shows as well. So by cracking down on non-background check sales, by cracking down on straw purchasing, you are making the entire hemisphere safer, not just the United States of America.
That was perfectly timed with that transition, because we just had an anonymous question about the international angle to America's gun violence problem. And that definitely was an excellent chapter of the book, and in a dimension that I think often is missing from the gun conversation in our political discourse. And so I want to be mindful of time here, but maybe one or two final questions here. We have this monumental election coming up, right? And whereas I think gun violence and the regulation of guns was a bit more front and center during the Democratic primary, it's definitely not as front and center right now, and for somewhat understandable reasons. And I think I'd be interested in your thoughts on where does this conversation go moving forward, right? Where does it fit into the broader political landscape?
So the set of issues being talked about on the cable news networks at night is not related often to the set of issues that matter to voters. Consistently in the last several elections, guns has been one of the top 2 or 3 issues that matters to voters. It was the number 2 issue in the 2018 elections, right behind the healthcare system. For Virginia voters in the midterms, in their 2019 elections, it was the number 1 issue ahead of healthcare, taxes, immigration. And that's because it's an issue you can't escape. gun crimes are going up in many cities, right? It's a bigger issue in New Haven and Hartford than it was a year ago. Kids are going back to school and doing their fall active shooter drills. Parents are having to deal with those conversations. And so even though it's not on the news, largely because there hasn't been a mega mass shooting in the last 6 months, it still is going to drive voters' decision-making. And so I actually think it's going to be one of the reasons that Joe Biden wins this election. I think it's one of the reasons why Democrats will win the Senate, because it continues to be a contrast between Democrats and Republicans. And my hope is that it is no longer a contrast 4 years from now, 6 years from now. I do not wish to continue to win elections as a Democrat because Republicans are so out of step with their constituents on the issue of guns. I want it ultimately to become a unifying issue. I think the only way we get there is likely by winning a few more elections and convincing Republicans that they can't win the Senate, the House, the presidency, unless they support things like universal background checks.
Excellent. I think that's a great note to end on. Senator, I just want to thank you on behalf of the law school and on behalf of the Law Review for joining us today, for sharing your book. Again, there's a link in the chat for everyone in the audience. If you haven't already, please check it out. The Senator's book is absolutely wonderful. And thank you again, Senator, so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for all the great work you do on this issue and subject. So thanks a lot.